My name is Rachel Monroe, and for a long time, I believed that love meant compromise, patience, and staying quiet when something hurt, especially when it came to family. I believed that if I tried harder, planned better, and gave more, things would eventually feel fair. That belief followed me all the way to the morning I stood in my kitchen, watching my husband and my mother-in-law walk out the door on a trip I had planned, booked, and paid for without me. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't argue. They didn't even look guilty. They simply told me there had been a mix-up, that there were only 2 seats confirmed, that it would be easier if they went ahead and I stayed behind. Easier for who, they never said. I stood there frozen, holding my phone in my hand, staring at the confirmation emails with my name on every reservation, realizing I had just been quietly erased from my own vacation. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If your spouse and their parent left you behind on a trip you paid for, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and let the truth unfold on its own? Tell me in the comments, because this story is not just about a trip. It is about boundaries, respect, and what happens when people assume you will always clean up after their choices. If you are new here, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because stories like this are about real moments when someone finally stops being taken for granted. Now let me take you back to how this all began. I booked that trip because I wanted peace. I wanted 1 week where my husband Daniel and I could breathe, away from work, stress, and the constant presence of his mother, Linda, who somehow managed to be involved in every decision of our marriage without ever being held responsible for the tension she caused. The trip was meant to be a reset, a chance to remind ourselves why we married in the first place. I handled everything, flights, hotel, itinerary, even the suitcases, because that had become my role without anyone ever asking if I wanted it. Daniel thanked me, distracted and half listening, while Linda criticized the destination, the hotel, and the timing, but still happily accepted when she was invited along just this once. I told myself it was fine, that keeping the peace mattered more than my discomfort. The night before departure, I triple-checked everything, printed confirmations, and laid out 3 suitcases by the door, including the largest one, carefully packed with documents, essentials, and items I thought would make the trip smoother for everyone. That suitcase would become the center of everything that followed. The next morning, Daniel received a call from his mother, spoke in hushed tones, and then told me there had been a problem. According to them, the airline had only confirmed 2 seats. According to them, it made more sense for me to stay behind and sort it out later. According to them, I was being dramatic when I asked why the problem only affected me. I watched them leave, watched the car pull away, and felt something inside me shift from hurt to clarity. Because for the first time, I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not chase after them. I simply closed the door, sat down at the table, and realized that the suitcase they took with them contained far more than clothes. And when they finally opened it, thousands of miles away, they would understand exactly what it felt like to be left behind. Looking back, I can see now that the trip wasn't the beginning of my exclusion, it was just the moment it became impossible to ignore. Daniel and I hadn't always been this way. When we first married, he was attentive, affectionate, the kind of man who held your hand in public and asked what you thought before making decisions. But somewhere along the line, his mother, Linda, became a constant presence in our lives, not loudly or aggressively at first, but quietly, steadily, like water wearing down stone. She called every day, stopped by without warning, commented on how I cooked, how I cleaned, how I handled money, always framed as concern, never as control. Daniel brushed it off, saying she meant well, saying it was easier to let her have her way than argue. And little by little, I learned that if I wanted peace, I had to be the one who adjusted. I adjusted my schedule so Linda could visit. I adjusted my plans so Daniel wouldn't feel caught in the middle. I adjusted my expectations until I barely recognized them anymore. Decisions that should have been ours became discussions I was invited to observe, not participate in. Vacations were chosen based on what Linda preferred. Holidays were scheduled around her convenience. Even our finances shifted without real conversations, expenses approved after brief talks between mother and son that I was told about later. I told myself this was normal, that marriages required flexibility, that love meant compromise. What I didn't realize was that I was the only one compromising. The night I suggested the trip, I remember the relief I felt, the hope that maybe a change of scenery would remind Daniel that we were partners. He agreed quickly, almost too quickly, and Linda inserted herself just as easily, saying she deserved a break too, that family trips were important. I hesitated, then agreed, afraid that saying no would once again make me the problem. From that moment on, the trip stopped being about us and became another situation where my role was to organize, pay, and stay quiet. I handled bookings, confirmations, and logistics while Daniel nodded approvingly and Linda offered criticism disguised as advice. And the more I did, the more invisible I became, until the morning they left without me felt less like a betrayal and more like a conclusion. Sitting alone after the door closed, I replayed years of small dismissals that had trained them to believe I would always absorb the inconvenience, always fix what went wrong, always accept being second. That was when I finally admitted the truth to myself. This wasn't about airline seats or misunderstandings. This was about a marriage where my presence was optional and my contributions were expected. And for the first time since I said I do, I asked myself a question I had been too afraid to voice before. If I disappeared completely, would anything actually change for them? The house felt unnaturally quiet after they left, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and forces you to listen to your own thoughts. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the empty space where the suitcases had been lined up just hours earlier, and that was when I realized something that made my heart slow instead of race. I knew exactly what was inside the suitcase they had taken. Not because I had planned revenge in advance, but because I had packed the trip the way I always did, carefully, responsibly, thinking 3 steps ahead for everyone but myself. That large suitcase held more than clothes and toiletries. It held every essential document, every reservation printout, every envelope with emergency cash, every medication, every charger, every confirmation email printed and tucked into labeled folders. It held the hotel vouchers in my name, the return tickets, the insurance documents, and the contact information for the rental car, all booked under my account, because that was how it had always been. I handled details so no one else had to. I assumed, foolishly, that I would be there too. When they arrived at the airport, I imagine it didn't take long for things to start feeling off. Without me there to check in, to answer questions, to smooth over confusion, small problems likely grew into real ones. The flight attendants would have asked for identification that didn't match the primary booking. The hotel desk would have asked for the cardholder whose name was on every reservation. Linda would have complained. Daniel would have apologized. And then, eventually, they would have opened the suitcase, expecting comfort, familiarity, something to ground them, only to realize that everything they needed to continue the trip depended on the person they had left behind. My phone started ringing that afternoon. First Daniel. Then Linda. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing a problem I hadn't caused. Hours passed. Messages piled up. Confusion turned into irritation, irritation into panic. When Daniel finally texted, his tone had changed completely. He asked where the documents were, where the hotel confirmation was, why nothing seemed to work. I read the message slowly and felt a strange calm settle over me. The truth was simple. The trip was never theirs to take without me. Not because I wanted control, but because I had been the one holding everything together all along. As the evening went on, the calls became more urgent. Linda accused the airline. Daniel blamed the hotel. And eventually, they both blamed me, asking why I hadn't fixed it remotely, why I was being difficult. That word made me smile sadly. Difficult. That was what I had been called every time I asked to be considered. I finally replied with a single message, calm and factual. Everything you need is in the account under my name. The reservations are mine. I am at home. After that, the calls stopped. I imagined them standing in a hotel lobby, exhausted and embarrassed, realizing that without me, the trip they had taken for granted could not exist. And in that moment, the balance shifted. Not because I raised my voice or demanded anything, but because I did nothing at all. I stayed home, made myself dinner, and slept peacefully for the first time in months, knowing that for once, they were experiencing what it felt like to be excluded, confused, and expected to manage without support. They came back 3 days later, earlier than planned, quieter than I had ever seen them before. The front door opened without the usual chatter or complaints, and I knew before I even saw their faces that something fundamental had shifted. Daniel looked tired in a way sleep could not fix, his shoulders slumped, his confidence worn thin. Linda avoided my eyes completely, moving past me as if the house suddenly felt unfamiliar to her. For a moment, no one spoke, and in that silence, I realized how rarely silence had ever worked in my favor before. Daniel broke it first, asking why I had not answered my phone, why I had let things get so complicated, why I had not helped when they clearly needed me. His words were sharp but unsure, like someone reaching for authority they no longer possessed. I listened without interrupting, the way I always had, but this time something was different. When he finished, I told him calmly that I had not complicated anything, that I had simply stopped compensating for decisions that excluded me. Linda scoffed and said I had embarrassed them, that people had been confused, that the trip had been ruined, and for a brief second, I almost laughed at how familiar those accusations sounded. Embarrassing. Ruining things. Being difficult. I had carried those labels for years without ever being asked how it felt. I told them that what embarrassed me was being left behind on a trip I planned and paid for. What ruined things was realizing my marriage functioned perfectly fine without my presence as long as my labor remained invisible. Daniel tried to argue, tried to explain that he had been under pressure, that it was easier to go along with his mother than to fight, and that was when I finally said the words I had been practicing in my head since the morning they left. Easier for you is not the same as fair to me. Linda snapped that families make sacrifices, that I should understand that, and I looked at her steadily and said that sacrifice without respect is not love, it is expectation. The room went quiet again, heavier this time, because for the first time, I was not asking to be chosen, I was choosing myself. I told Daniel that I would no longer organize, finance, or smooth over a life where my voice was optional, that marriage required partnership, not convenience, and that if he wanted to continue being married to me, things would have to change immediately. No more decisions made without me. No more prioritizing his mother's comfort over my dignity. No more assuming I would always be there to fix what others broke. Linda laughed bitterly and said I was overreacting, that I would calm down eventually, and that was the moment I understood that this conversation was not for her. It never had been. I told Daniel he needed to decide whether he was married to me or still living as his mother's son first, and I told him he did not need to answer right away, because for once, I was not chasing an answer. In the weeks that followed, things did not magically improve, but they did become clearer. Daniel struggled, stumbled, tried to negotiate boundaries as if they were temporary inconveniences, and I held firm in a way I never had before. I stopped managing his relationship with his mother. I stopped anticipating problems before they happened. I stopped making myself smaller to keep the peace. Some days were lonely. Some nights were painful. But even in that discomfort, there was a sense of honesty I had been missing for years. The suitcase incident was never about revenge. It was about visibility. About letting people experience the consequences of assuming someone will always be there, no matter how they are treated. Whether my marriage ultimately survives is still a question I am answering one day at a time, but what I know for certain is this: I will never again pack my life into a suitcase for people who are willing to leave me behind. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt invisible in your own relationship, ever felt valued only for what you provide and not for who you are, I want you to know that you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to step back. And you are allowed to let others feel the weight of their choices. Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were in my place. Would you have confronted them immediately, or waited like I did and let the truth reveal itself? If this story resonated with you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Thank you for listening, and remember, respect is not something you earn by sacrificing yourself, it is something you demand by knowing your worth.